right. So, hello everyone.
Hi, yes, now we can see your screen. Maybe put on slideshow.
Sure, I will do that. All right. Hi everyone. My name is Kwame Odame, and I'm presenting this project on behalf of my team. This project is on the topic towards a disability inclusive urban transport systems in Accra. The bigger project was between Nairobi and Accra, but for the sake of this conference, I'm presenting one perspective of the story using a policy practice agenda. I must say that the project was funded by the VREF. However, we also had a great input from various partners, of whom I have invited some to be here, and I want to really acknowledge their contribution to the project. Because it was a transport and disability study, I had various partners across the spectrum from the transport and disability side, as well as scholars and resource personnel from my university. So generally, access to transport is crucial, not only for low-income people, but for everybody. One of the key reasons is that the various opportunities we want to visit, schools, nightclubs, churches, mosques, and etc., can easily be reached through transport services. But if you read the literature, both locally and internationally, you realize that not everyone in the traveling population enjoys the same level of ease. And among these population group, persons with disability have heavily been represented among those who encounter challenges in moving from one point to the other. Among the reasons for the dominance of disability include the fact that their issues seem to be more permanent and lasting when compared to the aged or pregnant women or even children whose issues are quite transitionary. The other reason is that if you also look at the numbers, the disability community constitutes about 15% of the global population, making them the world's largest minority group. For us as transport geographers, the relationship between transport and disability is quite important because persons with disability are quite represented when you look at the poverty population, particularly within the context of Ghana. And because PWDs are well represented within the poverty bracket, ownership of private cars is actually near impossible for them. And for that matter, they largely become captive users of public transport services in this regard. But if you look at Ghana as a sovereign nation, we realize that far from 2006, Ghana was among some of the few countries to be a signatory on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, giving us a beacon of hope on Ghana's readiness to actually mainstream disability issues across the various spectrum. But for the sake of academic research and attention on disability issues, available literature, particularly within the local context, seem to focus on transport issues for the general population who do not necessarily have a disability. And so we tend to focus on issues between PWDs and non-PWDs, rather than looking at issues between the various disability groups. What this does is that usually, because the disability group are marginalized along this discussion, all the argument focuses on persons who do not have a disability, and so they become the focus point for recommending solutions and recommendation on how to improve upon the mobility options among the general population. And for us, this seems to be one of the biggest challenges we realize, because the general traveling population is not homogeneous. It's not everyone who has two functional eyes and limbs, and there are people amongst us whose physical condition may require that we alter our environment in a way that could actually accommodate them. One of the few things the study sought to do categorically was to shine light on the disability group by looking at their mobility patterns, examining their needs, experiences, exploring their challenges, and also giving us an opportunity to use this empirical evidence to look at the impact of transport choice on their activity participation and their quality of life. Sure. And so within the whole of Ghana, the Accra Metropolitan Assembly was selected as the study site, and the map of the study area is right to your left. One of the key reasons that informed the selection of this study area includes the fact that this geographical area situates Ghana's national capital city of Accra. And so being the area with the highest urban population, it also draws upon it people from all walks of life, people from all tribes, people from all demographics, that also reflects in the increasing proportion of the disability community within them. So with the high population comes high disability population, high vehicular population, and also the residential area for most stakeholders who are into the transport and disability space. Another reason why we sought to select the Accra metropolitan area includes the fact that this area has the widest and most diverse public transport options for all population groups. So we have all sorts of transport options, all sorts of transport levels within their scales, and a good opportunity to use Accra as a beacon to look at what will happen in other locations, because Accra would mimic other urban areas which looks or situate itself around Accra. For this study, we have 3 different target populations. So we had the target population from the demand side and that of the supply side of transport services. From the demand side, we have persons with disability. And because Ghana's disability community has a tall list of many smaller groups within them, the study only chose 3 different disabilities to be pooled. The literature even indicates that these disability groups were the most disadvantaged when it comes to the provision of transport services. And by that, we had the physically challenged, the hard in hearing, the visually impaired, of whom we had close to 180. But beyond the physically challenged, the deaf, and the visually impaired, we also had a different set of group among these people of whom we administered a journey access to, which constituted about 24. So this will include the users of the transport services. And from the supply side, we had operators of public transport services, which we had 24. And then we also had stakeholders who were into the disability and transport services within the metropolitan area of Accra, where the study was undertaken. So if you look at the pictures I attached, I have snapshots of some PWDs who were engaged for the study to my left, and some transport operators who were also engaged for the study to my right. We use both qualitative and quantitative research designs. Initially, we started off with a questionnaire for PWDs, and as you can see to my right, the questionnaire allowed us to do a survey of PWD, their travel needs, experiences, and in the picture there is a research assistant who was actually engaging a visually impaired. We also had a journey access tool, which allowed us to have an accompanied walk or trip with PWDs, allowing us to also observe for ourselves the real lived experiences of these participants as they enjoy transport services from one point to the other. And for the stakeholders we engage them through the interview guide, where we had various forms of interaction for them to also explore and also expose to us the various interventions and extent to which our environment actually accommodates the needs of PWDs. The final instrument we actually thought was quite important was to have a sort of auditing scheme, which categorically helped us to ascertain for ourselves whether or not our public transport operators in Ghana actually comply to the dictate of Ghana's Disability Act. If you look at the Ghana Disability Act, it has a specific transport provision that enjoins transport providers to offer specific tools and services. So beyond the narratives of the transport providers, we also identify 4 of the biggest transport terminals in Accra and also examine the kind of facilities they had, just to make sure the stories and the issues we had from the fields will corroborate with the findings we also had from the ground. So these will begin the findings from the study. As I said, because empirical studies usually show the mobility issues of the disability community, we started off by exploring the mobility patterns by looking at some of the key issues and places PWDs within the study areas would love to visit and go within their everyday living experiences. And so if you look at the mobility pattern, you could identify that trips for shopping, leisure activities, trips for schools, walking and religious activity appear to be some of the top key places PWDs within the study area would love to go. However, the frequency of visiting all these key life-enhancing opportunities was different for each of the participants, simply because each of them had their different life goals and various activities they engage in. So if you look at work activities, you could tell that less than 12% of the participants actually go to work on a daily basis, as compared to those who go to work on a weekly basis for those who had part-time jobs. If you also look at shopping activities, the third column, you could tell that PWDs within the study area usually undertake shopping activities mostly on a weekly and monthly basis, whilst leisure was also seen probably on a yearly basis and weekly as compared to monthly. However, as participants identify their various mobility patterns, it was also imperative we also examine the means by which PWDs or the participants actually reach all of these opportunities. And if you look at the yellow markings on the various bars, you could tell that the common minibus transport services, which we call the trotro, the Kenyans call it matatus, and the South Africans call it the minibus taxis, seem to have been quite prominent among the various mobility options for which PWDs within the study area would love to engage in visiting the various opportunities. But I must say that the choice of these trotro services was also dependent on the purpose for which participants actually hope to enjoy. And so in the case of healthcare services, you realize that trotro services was not actually the most dominant preferred mode, simply because the urgent services and demand for healthcare services and the need to avoid time wasting push them to opt for more perceived efficient transport services, which are more inclined to be e-hailing services or shared taxi services, as compared to all others that actually resort to the use of these trotro matatus or the minibus taxi services as the best option for them to enjoy or to reach the various places they want to go. But in exploring respondents or participants' preference for these minibus transport services or the trotro or the matatus, one thing remained prominent. For PWDs, the economic cost implications of hopping onto these trotro services remained paramount for them. And for them, it was all about money and the issue of being able to reduce the cost of travel, the monetary cost of traveling. But beyond the common issues of money, the economic cost of traveling, two other issues were also evident in the findings and the data we collected from the field. And one of these include the fact that PWDs identified these minibus taxi services or trotro services to offer them a sense of community that would actually not be realized if they hop on the taxi services or Uber services around. And for them, this sense of community allow them to experience the real world situations of the everyday Ghanaian that will not actually be realized if they hop onto other transport options that would give them some sort of exclusive services like Uber, for instance. And so within this sense of community, engagement in argument on sports, politics, engagement in other social issues allowed PWDs to expand their social network and also live a more fulfilled life. And secondly, the other reason that informed the choice for trotro services, in this case, the public transport service, was a sense of personal safety PWDs enjoyed when they actually hop onto these transport services. And this was quite important at a time where PWDs were identified or were rumored to be the subject for ritual murders and killings, simply because some people thought having a disability made you eligible to have some powers that could make you a good candidate for ritual murder. And so the presence of many eyes on board actually prevented them from being targets for kidnapping and these ritual murder. And for them, these trotro services were the best option for them beyond the economic cost and the sense of community that actually comes with usage. But even though the participants identified trotro services as the most preferred for their usage, key challenges that were experienced in the use of these trotro services were largely witnessed within the context of the quality of the terminals where these shuttles stop and actually alight, stop for PWDs to join or alight, the quality of the buses itself they hop on, as well as the attitude of transport operators who actually interact with PWDs as they sought to move from one point to the other within the city of Accra. Now, with regards to all of these, prominent issues that came up among the quality of these transport services stemmed from or came up or were manifested with reference to the presence of wayfinding aids on board as a way for the visually impaired participants to mostly identify where they have gotten to in order for them to even project their trip as they journey along the route. And traditionally or typically within the typical Ghanaian situation, one of the simplest ways that PWDs, in this case, the visually impaired, sought to have a realization of their environment was to heavily focus on the call-outs from the conductors who were kind of assistants to the various drivers. And so these call-outs from the conductors give an indication to which vehicle was closer to you or the next bus stop or junction the particular vehicle was actually heading towards. But the study realized that these call-outs from the conductors were not purposefully done as a way to target the visually impaired or reduce the burden to which they enjoy the transport services, but was rather done as a way to draw the attention of prospective passengers, especially when there were vacant seats on board. However, within this, these call-outs significantly reduced when there were virtually no seats on board, and PWDs were always found wanting when they had to make these travel trips, unless they had to actually fall on other travel groups in order for them to ascertain. Additionally, because these call-outs were done manually, forgetfulness on the part of these conductors or even disruption to their daily activities in these call-outs ended some of these participants in wrong locations, leaving them with no other option to find their way back, since most of these transport trips were non-refundable so long as the trip was embarked on. But beyond the dominance and reliance on these call-outs, PWDs within the study, however, identified some ways within which they adapted to also have a sense of where they have gotten to along the trip as a way of reducing their reliance on transport operators who were constantly disappointing them. And two of the key issues had to do with the use of known landmarks and personal intuitions. And so the visually impaired participants were sort of familiar with the routes that they actually count the number of twists and turns the vehicle will take as a way of ascertaining where they have gotten to, or probably use other landmarks like the negotiation of runabout, the smoothness of the route, the slope of the route itself, or sometimes special sounds and sights in specific places like markets areas as a way of also identifying them. Surprisingly, digital technology appeared in the data as an alternative for visually impaired to find their ways around, to find their ways when traveling from one area to the other. Unfortunately, these digital technology appeared in the form of mobile phone applications, largely Lazzarello for the blind and Be My Eyes. But for participants, these mobile-friendly applications were less reliable as they rely on internet connectivity in order for them to use that. And again, because these internet connectivities are paid for and do not actually come for free, this limitation in acquiring the data also made it difficult for them. And so whatever happens, they had no other way than to be at the mercy of these transport operators who might sometimes disappoint them, or in pursuit to escape that, they may tend to fall on other travelers, which actually reduces people's understanding or comprehension of what disability stands for. However, for the physically challenged who came up in the study, the most dominant issue for them was issues relating to entry and exit. And this was very important since the floor height of most of the vehicles examined in the study were beyond the recommended height of 230 milliliters. And so in all the study sites that were visited, none of the vehicles examined were found to even be to the standards, as most of them were above them. Even though these public transport buses were above them, no ramps or any form of assistive aid were identified on board to even facilitate the easy movement of wheelchair users in particular from the ground onto the vehicles. And as you can see in the picture, some of the common ways for which wheelchair users in particular had to hop on board onto these public transport services was to receive these mechanical assistance where transport operators or good willing passengers had to facilitate their entry. And all of this came with some psychological trauma. As to them, it did not project disability in a good way to people. Even beyond the issue of entry and exit, priority seats, on the other hand, were also a bigger issue, simply because none of the buses even examined had any form of priority seats. And so whatever these PWDs would do, they always had to contend with the general population in order to find a place to sit, and they were simply not assured of any seat. What it means is that the only way PWDs could get any seat of their choice was based on their long-lasting friendship with transport operators, or sometimes transport operators' own goodwill in order for them to reduce the assistance they offer to PWDs. But I must say that the issue of priority seats is categorically stated in Ghana's Disability Act that enjoins transport operators to actually reserve these seats for all PWDs. Unfortunately, evidence from the field, pictures and annotations from transport operators indicated the near absence of all of these things. Even when there were clear evidence that our public transport services did not meet the needs of persons with disability, all the public transport operators who were engaged in the study, as you can see in the image to my right, seem to have no knowledge on the Ghana's Disability Act, even though some of them had bragged to have been in business for over 30 to 40 years. And even though there seemed to be no knowledge on the existence of Ghana's Disability Act, again, local bylaws within the various transport terminals as a way of acknowledging the presence of persons with disability and coming to terms with putting up practical measures to meet their needs were non-existent. What it means is that common sense was always the basic principle for which transport operators always responded to the needs of PWDs. And by here, transport operators' discretion was always the ultimate. So long as the transport operator does not see it fit to offer the kind of service he or she identifies to merit a PWD, that service is never offered unless the PWD either seek the services of other transport services that may come at a higher cost for PWDs. However, when all of these discussions were brought before transport operators and the research offered them the opportunity to look at the policy instrument that actually enjoins them to offer all of these services, transport operators made one categorical statement that so long as these policies are there, and if the government should make any efforts to make them mandatory for transport operators to offer all of these services, they would actually put in every effort to resist all of these attempts in order for them to provide these stated responsive services to the needs of persons with disability. And please don't be quick to judge them. The issue about their resistance was not because they were not sympathetic. To most of these transport operators, these were more economic inclined decisions because to them, providing ramps and offering new buses that could be friendly to PWDs will come at a much higher cost that they were not actually ready to accommodate and bear. The other issue had to do with transport, other stakeholders who were also engaged. And so here we looked at the transport inclined stakeholders and the disability inclined stakeholders. And one thing remained clear: there seemed to be no synergy between the transport inclined stakeholders who were within the city authorities, the Transport Operators Association, the national agencies in charge of transport operators. All of these transport inclined stakeholders seem to focus very little or nothing at all when it comes to disability issues when providing transport services. On the other hand, the disability inclined stakeholders who were also engaged seem to have no transport issues inclined when actually offering disability mainstreaming services for persons with disability within the city of Accra. And so this mismatch, this misalignment of focus and attention sought to have remained clear, even though the study felt that a review of these issues and an integration of one side of the story into the other's work would offer a greater way in order for us to also look at the way of making our transport services more inclusive for persons with disability. So having brought all of these issues as...
Hello, Kwame, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, fantastic. I'm told we really are running short of time.
That's my last slide.
Yes, I was just asking you to kindly fasten it a little bit.
Okay, so having brought all of these issues forward, the empirical evidence would offer us the opportunity to look at what is actually present. And the next thing we hope to do is to also go beyond the empirical evidence to look at implementation issues with reference to policy and regulations and how we can bridge these issues to bring into being disability and transport issues when looking at the inclusiveness or the rate of integrating PWDs within the disability community. And so this is basically the issues that we have actually been doing for the past 12 months. And I'll be happy to engage each of you on various issues that you may think will be necessary or otherwise. Other than that, this brings the end to my presentation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Kwame. That was a wonderful presentation. Yes, please. You can clap for him. The live audience here at Stanley really appreciate your presentation. Allow me to very quickly introduce our next speaker, who is Lesedi Mokoma from the University of Pretoria. Lesedi, can you hear me? Hello, Lesedi. Is Winnie with us? Winnie Sambo, as we try to get in touch with.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. It's Lesedi.
Yes, Lesedi, please carry on.
Okay, so I can start presenting.
Yes, you can. And I would kindly request you to speed it up a little bit just because we are running behind on time.
Okay, I will do that.
Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can see my slides. All right. I'm Lesedi Mokoma from the University of Pretoria, and I'm going to be presenting on a project that I've been doing at the University of Pretoria with Makerere University as well, and Where is My Transport in London. And the project is called Exploring Information Behavior of Informal Transport Users in Uganda and South Africa. All right. So public transport users need information for a variety of reasons, and the most common ones are that they need information for supply. So they need to understand the network coverage. They need to understand if the available services will cover their origins and their destinations. They also need to know how often the public transport system will come, and when it'll depart and when it's going to arrive at their destination. Secondly, they need to understand the reliability of the service. So they need to know what the waiting times will be. They need to understand delays. And if there are delays, are there other alternatives available for them to use? Users also want to compare prices between different services, and they want to also look at the different discounts. And they also need to understand, how to purchase tickets. Should they purchase a ticket inside a vehicle, or should they purchase a smart card, and how should they load it, and so on. They also need to understand safety and security of transport systems, and that is both the vehicle as well as the facilities that they use. And lastly, the users also want to know what is the comfort and convenience of a transport system. They want to know, for example, if there's seats that are available, if the vehicle is old, if it's roadworthy, if it's going to be comfortable when they're traveling. So information is quite important, and it's emerging as a very key dimension of mobility. And so it is an important lever for sustainable transportation, access in sub-Saharan African cities. Information enables users to make informed decisions. They get to know when to get a transport service, when and how it's going to travel. So they get to have more choices. And so when you don't have information, then you have serious barriers to equity and to human development goals, because people don't actually know what to use when they want to move. So we have various transport systems in sub-Saharan Africa. We've got formal ones, the very new ones, such as BRT systems, as well as in South Africa, you've got the Gautrain, which is a rapid rail system. And these systems have got very comprehensive information. They've got real-time information, they've got websites, they've got variable message signs. So it isn't very difficult for you to find out what to do or how to use transport when you are using formal transport systems. But then when we look at informal transport systems, we see that people are still reliant on socially transmitted channels for information, and also having to observe their travel environment when they're moving. And, so there has been some developments around us in sub-Saharan Africa about information. There's been companies that have been collecting data on public transport that's informal. They've collected operational data on routes, on fares, on stops, but this information usually doesn't it doesn't reach the users. It's data that's often used by transport planners and consultants. It doesn't really improve information seeking for the users. And that is why we have this particular research. We want to understand the information landscape of informal transport in sub-Saharan Africa. We want to explore information behavior of passengers. We want to understand how passengers, or what strategies the passengers use when they want to source information, and how do they actually use this information, and also how do they share information. But more importantly, we want to know if information seeking for informal transport can actually be an enabler, or it can be a barrier to movement. Lastly, we want to identify potential implications for information providers and opportunities for providing enhanced information services. So this project that we're undertaking at the University of Pretoria takes place in 2 different cities in 2 countries. It takes place in the city of Kampala in Uganda, as well as in the city of Tshwane in South Africa. The work is ongoing in both these countries, but it's nearly concluding in the city of Tshwane. So the methodology is as follows. We've got 2 steps that we take. Firstly, we have a transport information landscape, which is just a desktop study, as well as interviews with operators, as well as transport officials that are in the municipality, just to ask them about information strategies or information seeking that you have for informal transport. The second part is the field work, which is the exciting part for us. And here it also has 2 parts. The first part, firstly, we had to recruit 30 participants in both countries. And these 30 participants would firstly do travel diaries. For 3 days, they would just record their daily movements. And from this information, we were able to understand their personal characteristics, as well as the mobility characteristics of these different respondents. And then the second part was the in-depth interviews that took place. And these ones were really about, we were actually asking the participants about how they sourced the information when they undertook those 3 trips that they recorded in their travel diaries. They had to also make drawings, and in these drawings, they had to show the information sources that they used throughout the 3 days. And most importantly, they also had to show us how they felt, or their emotional responses when they were receiving information during their trips. So I'm just going to give you some of the highlights or some of the results that we got from the Tshwane case study. So it's because it's mostly about the city of Tshwane throughout the presentation. I'm going to be mentioning the minibus taxi. The minibus taxi is the dominant informal mode of transport in South Africa. Okay, so what we saw from our interviews is that before a trip begins, a lot of the users, especially the younger generation, would use information technology to locate themselves or to locate their destinations. So they would use Google Maps to understand exactly where they're going, and then they would even find some landmarks which they would use when they explain to an informant about how to get to where they're going using the minibus taxi. So once the users had this information, they would then go to their social networks, and this could be close relations, you know, their friends, their neighbors, their bosses, whoever that they feel close to and they trust. And they would ask this person using that location information, how do I get to a particular place? And this person would then give them information about which taxi to use, how much the fare costs, where to stop, which hand signal to use, and so on. And also quite important before a trip is the tacit knowledge. So this is knowledge that people will get from their social networks, such as hand signals, and also knowledge that they get from repetitive tasks, from simply knowing that, you know, since I live in a particular area, this is what we do when we want to use public transport. At the stop, people were really dependent on nonverbal and verbal communication. And this was actually one of the most difficult parts of the trip for the users. That was actually communicating and identifying the right person to speak to. So people had a lot of strategies for this, but the most common one was that they first had to greet someone to test if the person was friendly and approachable. And if the person responded, greeted back and smiled, then they knew that they could actually ask that person information about how to travel on the minibus taxi. So at first people would try the informal traders that work in minibus taxi ranks. Then the second option would be the passengers, and the last resort would usually be the taxi drivers and the queue marshals. And people said that The repercussions of choosing the wrong informant would lead to getting lost, running out of taxi fare, or in the extreme, you'd actually become a victim of crime if you speak to the wrong person. So this is just a picture over there of people who were talking in the taxi, trying to figure out where to go. Then people also relied heavily on hand signals. These are shown on top. The finger that's pointing up is going to town. The finger that's pointing down is local. So people use these hand signals to hail a minibus taxi. Also important is the use of decals and stickers shown at the top here. The stickers actually help people to identify the minibus taxi, which is going to take them to the correct destination. And what the taxi associations do is they will travel within communities, use loud hailers, and tell communities that if you want to identify the correct taxi, you have to look at a certain sticker. Then lastly, at the stop, you also have informal queue marshals, and these are people who are unemployed, who assist users as well as taxi operators with travel. So they would round up the users who are going to one destination, and they would help them to identify a taxi, and then they will charge the driver a small fee for their assistance. These informal queue marshals will also assist the users with carrying their luggage, carrying their shopping, and also they give advice on which taxi drivers drive recklessly and which ones are the safest to drive with. In the taxi, what people said was the only formal kind of information that they got was for fares, which was only posted on windows when there were fare changes. So once this notice on the window of a taxi is worn out, it wouldn't be replaced. And so people would now have to depend on asking the driver and asking friendly passengers for fare information. And unfortunately, because there's no other, formal source of information, sometimes the taxi driver would take advantage of users who are unfamiliar to the route and overcharge them. Or he'd tell the users that, the taxi, the price of fuel has gone up. So now the taxi fare has increased just so that he can pocket more money. And you also find passengers as well who would take advantage of other fellow passengers and say they have run out of money because they know that there's no formality in the minibus taxi. Also in the taxi as well, people said that, it was very difficult, or because the taxi route changes frequently, people would have to sit right next to the driver and tell him where they're going. So you have to sit by the driver and remind him constantly, the driver, I'm going to a particular destination, please don't forget, or else they will get lost. And on the right is just a picture of someone who was sharing an experience that they had in the taxi, where they had to tell the driver that they're getting off. And in the taxi, the language, is unique. You can't just say, I'm going to get off at so-and-so street. You have to tell the driver beforehand, short left, short right. So there's a particular lingo that you use. So there's a lot of stress that's involved when you want to stop a taxi as well. And lastly, off the taxi, people said that it was difficult to actually find exactly where your destination is. So they also dependent on social networks. They had to, WhatsApp people. They had to send SMSs. For them to know exactly where they're going. And if social networks weren't available, then they'd have to speak to the driver or speak to the queue marshal. So just looking at the emotional responses of both men and women, it was interesting to hear from women that they got information when they looked good. So if you look good and you dress really nicely, then you will get information. The drivers and the queue marshals will assist you much better. They complain that language can be a barrier. So in Tshwane, for example, there's areas where the languages are different. And if you can't speak a particular language, then most likely you're going to struggle to get information. Also, if you start to speak English in a minibus taxi, there may be issues. You'll be told, you're not a white person. You need to speak the African language for us to assist you. The ladies also said that older men were more helpful and more respectful. When they spoke to the younger men, the younger men expected them to give them the telephone numbers or to just, to just do things that they didn't want to do. So they were actually more comfortable around the older men. And then the women complained that they never really knew which taxi driver was legitimate. They spoke about instances where the taxi driver would just change the route, drive off and pull out a gun, and people would just get robbed. So they were always insecure about, is the taxi driver really legitimate or not? A lot of the females spoke about how transfers were extremely stressful. So even if you're a minibus taxi user and you use this service every day, transfers are very stressful because they're complicated. They're really disorderly. They move around a lot. So you have to depend on the drivers. You have to listen really intently for you to understand which vehicle you're going to be transferring to. And also when you're on a new trip, or when you're undertaking a new trip, you had to sit next to the driver as well so that you don't get lost. And then the men complained that the taxi drivers treat them like children. They felt disrespected all the time, most of the time. And they said that you have to humble yourself. Even if the taxi driver is a teenager and you're a middle-aged man, you have to really humble yourself and be respectful if you want to get any form of decent information. And men also mentioned that transfers are also very stressful. They spoke about how it was more stressful when your trip was very time sensitive. For example, if you've got a job interview or you need to get to work at a particular time, taxis took forever to get full, and the taxi always moves once the taxi's full. It won't move if the seats aren't fully occupied. So the fact that there was no clarity on travel time was a serious problem for the men. In conclusion, what we saw so far from our ongoing study is that information seeking is quite unpleasant, even for people who use minibus taxis every single day. It's quite stressful. It's difficult to approach drivers and to speak to queue marshals. You have to understand, you have to sort of read their moods, read their body language. You have to select who you need to speak to, because maybe you're going to speak to somebody who's having a bad day and he's going to give you the wrong information. A lot of the people depend on their social networks, especially before the trip begins. They plan out their trips by speaking to neighbors, speaking to friends, speaking to colleagues before they start to travel. And they also depend as well on technology. They use Google Earth, Google Maps, and so forth. And then commuters said that they really had to learn how to humble themselves. So you really have to be respectful. You need to speak in a particular way if you want to get information. And they feel very stressed, very anxious when they're at transfers, because it's very chaotic. It's very difficult to understand what's going on. You have to really listen intently if you don't want to get lost. And also what was also quite stressful is new trips. So even if you're familiar with the area, new trips are very, very stressful. Things move around a lot. Taxi ranks change. That environment is just very stressful. And in closing, people also wish that there could be more destination signs on vehicles, at facilities, and also better customer service. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to, yes, please, you could clap for her. Thank you very much, Lesedi. And we want to very, very quickly move on to the next speaker, which is Winnie Samba. Winnie, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. And I'd kindly request you to also just hurry up a little bit because of time. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. If Lesedi could stop sharing the screen so that I can share mine.
I'm trying to stop.
No, it's stopped now. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so I think I'm sharing mine now as well. So thanks again for inviting us to present our work. This is very much ongoing work. And so what I'll be presenting today is preliminary findings from some of the research that we've undertaken with marginalized groups in Malawi and Kenya. Basically, what we're trying to understand is their user needs and practices in respect to transportation and mobility, and also to explore the role of bicycles in mitigating the mobility exclusion in the two countries. So I'll quickly mention that this is a collaborative project between two institutions. We've got World Bicycle Relief and the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. I think 2 or 3 of my colleagues, Marcy, Nixon, and Gail are here. So maybe just to mention a little bit about World Bicycle Relief, because I recognize that some people may not be so familiar with the organization, but we are a not-for-profit organization that works across Sub-Saharan Africa as well as Latin America. We believe in the power of bicycles to transform lives as a tool, as a transportation tool, as a mobility tool. And so we distribute bicycles, we donate bicycles to those who are unable to afford transportation, mainly people living in rural parts of various countries across Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in Colombia and Latin America. And so you'll see on this end, I've got school children in Kenya who've recently received bicycles. And we've got community health workers in Zimbabwe who also have access to bicycles. Just want to mention that our program, we target 70% women and girls. So we've got a very specific gender approach to how we donate the bicycles, because we recognize that women and girls are less likely to own and even use bicycles. If you want to learn more about World Bicycle Relief, please visit our website. So just a little bit about background information on this research project. I think this is the issue of transportation disadvantage or exclusion is something that has come across quite strongly in very many of the presentations. And we know that generally there is limited access to reliable and affordable transportation for people living in low income settings, and also including those who are living in urban and peri-urban areas of African cities, as well as more secondary cities and towns. And what we know is that walking is a default mode of travel for many. Again, particularly for women, this is something that has come across over and over during this conference. And I just want to, as an example, show some findings from a market research survey that we ran in Malawi, research project that's funded by USAID, looking at the bicycle market system in Sub-Saharan Africa. And here we looked at the primary transportation modes for men and women when they travel to work or to the market. And you can see the gender disparities across the two. So for example, you've got more than 60% of women saying they rely primarily on walking to get to work or market. At the same time, you've got half of the male respondents saying they actually use a bicycle to get to the work or market. So again, something that's come through is that there are adverse effects on what this lack of access to transportation has, from access to essential services, such as education and health, to poor livelihoods, to social exclusion, poor food security, as well as multidimensional forms of poverty. So how do bicycles fit in within this context? Numerous studies have shown that cycling as a mode of travel has the potential to mitigate these challenges, but it is less commonly practiced than it used to be. However, you will, for most of us who will recognize traveling through rural or secondary cities in a lot of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, including Kenya, where I'm actually from, is that you will notice that you will typically find bicycles being a very common mode of travel, particularly for men, and they also use it to transport goods. And in the case of Malawi, it's also used as a bicycle taxi that you can actually hire and rent a bicycle and use it. What we do know is that ownership and usage of bicycles by women remains low. So again, citing this research from Malawi, where we found that when we asked respondents whether there was a bicycle in their household and who owns the bicycle, we found that 45% of the men said they own the bicycle in their household, and only 15% of women said they own the bicycle in their household, that they own a bicycle in their household. And then when we asked them about who's the primary user of the bicycle, 83% of the men said in their household, if there's a bicycle, they are the primary user, compared to only 27% of women. So one of the key issues that actually is a barrier to ownership of bicycles is cost, the affordability of a bicycle. Another issue is the availability of high quality and durable bicycles. But what we also know is that bicycles have been shown to have a positive impact on mobility, and this is numerous research that's been done, particularly in the context of rural areas. And here is just some of the key findings that we have found from some of our research projects, some of which have been led by external evaluators, that have shown that access to bicycles can have significant effects on mobility and travel. So for example, we found that the amount of time that children spend traveling to school reduced by approximately 1 hour once they had access to a bicycle. We've also seen that girls are less likely to miss school because of safety concerns. And we've also seen that other farmers reporting increased profits because they now have access to a transportation tool which they use for livelihood purposes, and community health workers showing that they see more patients. So in this current research project, moving on to it, our aim really is to understand what the transportation needs and experiences of people living around secondary cities are. And the other thing is also to examine what the viability of bicycles is as a transportation solution for them. And so we've conducted the research in 2 locations across Africa, Zomba in Malawi. For some of you may be familiar, Zomba is a small secondary city, used to be the former administrative capital of Malawi. And the other location is Kakamega, Kenya, which is also an emerging, it's a town emerging secondary city. We're collecting both qualitative and quantitative research, and I'm going to be speaking specifically to qualitative research because that's what we've just concluded. Our qualitative research was collected through focus group discussions, and as well as key informant interviews. With the focus group discussions, we also incorporated mobility mapping and participatory methods to understand how people travel and what challenges they face with travel. So this is what a participatory mobility mapping really looks like. In this case, we ask people to draw, to let us know where they travel, some of the key points of interest within their communities, such as markets, health centers, schools, and then how far they would need to travel from where they're based to access these services. So you can see in one case, one person, in one focus group discussion, people saying they would need to travel approximately 7 kilometers to access a health center. So what are the key findings that have emerged out of our research project? So the first thing I'm going to go through is what factors are underlying mobility and travel choices. And what I'm saying, actually presenting right now, is very similar to what we've had people mention during the other presentations during the conference. And what we found is that transportation really will depend on affordability. So people will heavily rely on walking, and then they will use other modes of travel when they can have the money. So for example, this focus group participant saying, I will walk. If I only have 20 shillings, then I will walk and walk until I get to a point where I can use 20 shillings to rent, to take a motorcycle or taxi. The other thing that emerged was the unpredictability of fares, transportation fares. So this is something that emerged through the focus group discussions, that there's increased transportation costs during the harvest season or during the rainy season. If the weather changes, then the transport costs change. But also we've got cases of people saying, I boarded a minibus taxi or a matatu, and halfway through my trip, the fare changed, and that I didn't have any more money, and so it ended up being an altercation between me and the touts. The other thing that really determines what transportation modes they use is the destination and the reason for travel. So in Kenya, the people tend to prefer using motorized transportation to ferry goods. For example, motorbikes, taxis, bodabodas, but in Malawi, bicycles are actually quite popular for transporting goods. The other factors that determine what the choices around transportation include the distances people travel, the convenience and the convenience of the transportation mode, as well as the urgency of the trip. Weather, as I mentioned, is also a key determinant. Terrain and topography also came into play. So some people saying, there are some places that are car can't reach or a bicycle can't reach, and so we have to walk. Poor roads and infrastructure is a key issues for people living in secondary cities. Safety and security is also a big concern. So when people lack transportation, what we had from one small trader in in Kenya was that if they lack the transportation money, then what they would do is that rather than go to the center of Kakamega town to buy, to acquire supplies to sell in their smaller markets, what they would do is that they would rely on the supplier. They would put in an order, rely on the supplier to put the goods into a vehicle and then send those goods to them. And so in such a scenario, there's always a risk of the goods either getting lost or the supplier sending poor quality goods. And so that affects their livelihoods. So what are the effects of this transportation when people are experiencing these transportation challenges? The first thing is that they would choose to forego travel altogether. The other is that they will sell household assets in order to pay for transportation, particularly during emergencies. And this was particularly something that really came out through the focus group discussions in Malawi, and one other thing that was interesting was that people saying sometimes in order to sell my assets, household assets like chicken and other livestock, I will not sell them to my neighbor, but I'll walk a long distance to sell them elsewhere because I don't want my neighbor to know that I have a problem. Another way in which people cope is that they borrow money in order to afford transportation costs, or they can travel on credit or make payment arrangements with a bicycle taxi or a border operator. The other thing is subsistence farmers report that they are unable to access extension services because they cannot travel to meeting points, or extension workers cannot reach them because of that lack of transportation. The other thing that came out strongly through our research is that the people report making trade-offs. For example, they will often choose to forego between traveling, spending on transportation, or spending on other household goods. So when it comes to having to make that trade-off, then transportation or travel falls to the third, or becomes a third or fourth most important item, and not really the most important item within the household. Again, travel to visit relatives and leisure purposes is very uncommon in these settings because of that lack of transportation. Small traders also report having to sell their produce at smaller markets because they have this very high cost of transporting goods to larger markets, or even though they know they will likely make more or better sales. Again, as I mentioned, another way they have another example of trade-offs is that they report not traveling to source supplies and instead making the orders and relying on suppliers to send them high quality goods, which in some cases does not happen. So another aspect, as I mentioned, that we're looking into is the viability of bicycles as a transportation solution in these settings. So what we've learned from our focus group discussions from the women is that, bicycles are generally viewed as positively. They are seen as more affordable than other motorized modes of transport. It's a once-off investment. After that, all one needs to deal with is maintenance and purchasing spare parts. They're also seen as very convenient, and they provide flexibility in the sense that they are easily to get, particularly in the context of Malawi, where women might not necessarily own bicycles, but they use bicycle taxis to commute. Bicycles are also important for ferrying palm produce and inputs, and so they are preferred over other modes of travel for this reason. The risk of accidents is also seen, particularly compared to motorcycles in the context of Kenya, where accident rates are quite high. Then cycling is less commonly mentioned by focus group discussion participants in Kenya, but it is a common feature of travel in Malawi. One thing that I must mention at this point is that there are gender dynamics in the ownership and usage of bicycles. This is not surprising. As I mentioned, women are generally less likely to own and use bicycles, or even access the bicycles in their household because of that patriarchal context where assets belong to the male, often the head of the household. And but in some cases, it's also seen as not culturally appropriate for women to cycle. I mean, I'm thinking growing up where I grew up in Eldoret, it was not very usual to see women using bicycles. So there's an emphasis on women wearing the right clothes when riding bicycles. And so women have to do things like wrap lassos or wrappers to cover themselves while traveling. And in some cases, they mention even men mentioned that women need to dress properly when they are using bicycles, maybe even wear a trouser or wear leggings because they don't want their features, the bodily features, to be exposed. The cost of purchasing bicycles is a key barrier for those who own. So for example, in the focus group discussions that we had with women in Kenya and Malawi, the ownership of bicycles among women was almost non-existent. And for most of them, they would mention they would want to own one, but cost is a key barrier. There's also concern about cost of repairs and maintenance, how to keep the bicycle running and maintain its durability. But there are also some concerns around the viability of usage, some concerns around, bicycles are slower, some concerns around terrain that, if it's hilly, it's difficult to cycle. Some also concerns around the poor infrastructure and road safety emerging. But one thing that's also important to note is that there's generally a desire for focus group participants for them to graduate to motorized modes of travel. So for example, women in Kenya would say, I want to own a motorbike, I want to own a motorcycle. And when we would ask them this, why, then it's not necessarily because they want to ride it, but it's because they see it as a source of income. They can hire someone to use it as a taxi and get some money out of it. So as I conclude, the key issues that have emanated from our research so far is that walking remains the default travel mode for most women. They're affordable. It's affordable, and when the next most affordable thing then is the bicycle in many cases. We've found that significant challenges still underlie mobility for people living in or around secondary cities, and this affects their travel choices, and they often have to make trade-offs. Bicycles are also viewed as a viable mode of transport, but there are gender dynamics around ownership and usage. And as I mentioned, the relatively high cost of acquiring and owning a bicycle are some of the key contributors to the low ownership rates that we see among women. So I'm going to stop here. This is ongoing research, and we're moving on to the next phase where we're collecting some quantitative data to supplement this initial qualitative data, and we will be sharing